Good morning. What better way to celebrate Shabbat than three Jews in a church talking about politics? I am guessing that all of you are just as interested in this and want me to get right to it as I am. So, gentlemen, is Trump guilty, or is he guilty with an explanation?
Maybe with an exclamation point.
Yeah.
That's the question is guilty of what? And one question that probably is on the minds of people who follow this is what he calls collusion. You know, this is a word that he's embraced as a straw man. No collusion, no collusion, no collusion. He claims that the report that came out yesterday from the House Republicans on the Intelligence Committee proves there's no collusion. If you read the report closely, it says, the people we spoke to said there was no collusion. That's what passes for a Republican investigation. But collusion is a pretty elastic term. It has no real legal definition. It's akin to, say, the term conspiracy, which does have a legal definition. And in our book, Russian Roulette, we don't really focus on to collude or not to collude, but we note that throughout the campaign, and we can get into some more details on this, the Trump people, they met with Russians, they signaled to Russians they were willing to conspire with them to accept information generated by the Kremlin against Hillary Clinton. When they had reason to know that the Russians had attacked the election, claimed that they had not, and so they provided cover for the Russian attack. And our term that we ended up using in the book was that Trump and his associates aided and abetted an attack on the United States.
And I should point out that actually, for all the shoddiness of the House Intelligence Committee report, there actually were a few new nuggets there that are quite damning when you think about it. One that I seized on right away, leapt out at me, is there's Michael Flynn. We all know he went to Moscow in December 2015 for the 10th anniversary celebration of RT, the Russian propaganda station, was paid $45,000, sat with Vladimir Putin that night at dinner, and then he becomes national security advisor to the Trump campaign, and after the election has these secret meetings with Ambassador Kislyak that ended up getting him in trouble and multiple conversations. One thing that was never clear is, did he have any communications with Kislyak before the election of Donald Trump? And there's this little nugget in the report from an email that actually he had met with Kislyak in December 2015. He and his son, before they flew over to Moscow, had a meeting at Kislyak's residence. The son followed up with this was a very productive conversation. They had an email to it. So that was at least the first sign of a pre-existing relationship between Flynn and Kislyak, which I thought was significant. And then there's also a little nugget about an email that Flynn sends to an unidentified person in July 15th of 2016, saying there are things happening in this election and will happen involving cyber activities that involving nation-state actors and the DNC. Now, that is a week before the WikiLeaks dumps those 20,000 emails from the DNC. Now, it's true that there were some Guccifer 2.0 had already started some of these leaks, but for Flynn to be attuned to that and then saying things that will happen did leap out to me as possible evidence of foreknowledge of what was about to happen.
This is all very complicated because you guys are like covering a house fire while it's still on fire.
Yes.
And so you've referenced the House Intelligence Committee Republican report that just came out, and that came out after you obviously published your book. So I'm just going to assume that most people here, because you're here on a Saturday morning to listen to us, are broadly aware of the case that you guys have laid out in the book, of the connections that David summarized. But so what's happened since then? You've mentioned a couple of things, little nuggets buried in the Republican report. Like, for example, we now know what Comey wrote in his memos, thanks to, again, to the House Republicans. Right. What, for example, in there has either advanced or contradicted the case that you lay out?
Well, there's nothing in it that contradicts, and it's even surprising.
Supplements, actually.
Well, it's surprising that the Republicans thought it was helpful to their case to release these memos. The memos are...
Do I need to explain what the Comey memos are? These are the memos...
He chronicles his various meetings and phone conversations with Donald Trump, which disturbed him to such an extent that he felt he needed to write memos about them immediately after they were done. And he testified about this material over a year ago now, about a year ago now, and that was all that is in our book. What's interesting in many ways in the memos is not what's really new, but it's, I think, more the tone. That here we have the FBI director, meeting with the president. It begins like sort of a week after the president takes office, and Trump is just obsessed with one thing. Do I have to say it? Do you want to say it?
Well, I was about to say that we've managed to go 7 minutes without mentioning it, which I think, and I've listened to a bunch of interviews with you two, that's a record. I think Terry Gross started right in.
Yeah, the tape that shall have no name. And Trump is just really obsessed with this and claims it didn't happen. He even tells him, as has been a controversy in the past week, that he never spent the night in Moscow. He tells Comey that to prove that this tape could not have come into existence. Well, the first chapter of our book is a detailed kind of tick-tock of Trump's time in Moscow, and there's nothing controversial about it. This was never, ever in dispute. He spent the night in Moscow. So why is he telling Comey he didn't? And that he even compounds the lie. And this is kind of, I think, what's revealing about Trump. He goes, I've checked. I've asked my friends. They all tell me I didn't spend the night in Moscow. I don't know who his friends are, but if he had checked with anyone or looked at flight logs or even looked at like Instagram accounts, Facebook accounts, or the videos of interviews that he gave, he would have seen not. So he just said anything that came to his mind to try to deny this.
And then this week, if I'm not mistaken, during one eruption of some kind, I don't know if it was on Twitter or on TV, he said, Comey says that I said I never went to Moscow. That's ridiculous. Why would I say that? Of course I was in Moscow.
Yes.
But his story does change from time to time, day to day, tweet to tweet.
Second to second.
I gotta say that, the most remarkable thing for me about the Comey memos is that January 27th dinner. This is the first sit-down the President of the United States is having with the FBI director.
Just been inaugurated. He invites Comey for dinner. No,
Private
this is not the Valentine's Day dinner, which is later. This is the
that
first
comes
one.
later. This is the dinner where he asks for loyalty. So Comey has this incredibly detailed account of everything they talked about, starting with the golden showers, which Trump was obsessing about, and then he wanted to talk about the 2016 election and the Hillary email accounts and investigation, and wants to know about Loretta Lynch and what did she do. And think about this for a moment. He's just been elected president of the United States, taken office. He's meeting with the FBI director for the first time. Not a single question about the terrorism threats to the country, about the cyber threats to the country, about what's happening with organized crime, what's happening with street gangs, the immigration problem. Nothing. What do you need to do your job better? All he's talking about are the allegations against him and the allegations against Hillary. I found that just astonishing on its face, that the lack of interest in sort of the basic, information he would need to do his job to protect the country, which presumably the FBI director would have been there to help him do.
Well, Comey, I think this is new, and you guys know better than I, but as part of his book tour, Comey said that during his first meeting with Trump at Trump Tower before the inauguration, he was really struck by they came over and they gave them this intelligence report, and all Trump and his associates were concerned with, well, how can we spin this? How can we make sure that nobody doubts that we were elected?
Exactly.
They didn't worry about
follow up
it.
because this is the opening scene in our book, that meeting. It's the introduction to the book. And Comey talks about presenting the summary of the dossier and the salacious allegation to Trump. What we talk about is what happened after Comey left the room and how Trump blows up, calls it a shakedown. He assumes that Comey is there trying to blackmail him because that's the way he thinks. That's what Roy Cohn would have done, his mentor. That's what J. Edgar Hoover used to do. So Comey, thinking he was giving Trump a heads up on allegations that are out there and might soon be surfacing in the media, but from Trump's perspective, there can only be one reason that Comey was doing it, and that sowed the seeds for what came later, including ultimately the firing of Jim Comey.
I know it's rather shocking, but in both of these meetings, what Trump cared most about was Donald Trump.
Whoa.
I mean, I hate to tell you that because I know no one has come to that conclusion yet on their own. And rather than, the first briefing, January 6th, is supposedly about the intelligence community's assessment that Russia attacked the United States, that it was done to help Trump, and it was comprehensive and extensive. And Trump asked not a single question about the threat posed to the United States, about what to do to prevent this from happening again. It's all about, did they change any votes? And they say, well, we didn't assess that. That's not part of our job to assess whether they actually affected the outcome of the election. He says, good, we're going to tell everybody they didn't, and that's the first tweets that come out of the meeting.
Right. And Comey elaborates on that.
Yes.
I had a couple of interesting reactions to reading your book, and again, I consider myself a completist when it comes to l'affaire russe. But one of them was that you've heard over the years now, I guess, since the election, this defense from the Trump camp. How could we possibly collude with Russia? We couldn't collude with ourselves.
Right.
Yeah.
This is something they've said. I think that's a quote, right? That we were so disorganized, nobody knew what anybody else was doing. Yeah. I don't know if that's true for the campaign. There were some smart people, if evil, working for the campaign. But reading your book made me more willing to believe that about Trump himself.
Well, the question is not whether he sat down with Russian agents and decided which documents to take out of the DNC and tell them, listen, I know the cutout in Spain who can get them to Wikipedia, WikiLeaks for us. It's not that. I think I mentioned the June 9th meeting at Trump Tower. This is indeed collusion. They get a message from a trusted business partner of Trump, Aris Agalarov, who put on the Miss Universe contest with Trump, with whom Trump nearly built a Trump Tower in Moscow, an oligarch who's very close to Putin. Get a message from him. The Kremlin has a secret plan to help you. We're sending an emissary to give you dirt on Hillary. And they say, yes, please. Donald Trump Jr. says, I love it. And yesterday we had more information that this emissary, Natalia Veselnitskaya, was connected to the Kremlin. In the book, we make that pretty clear, but there's more information that came out. And so they're sitting down with the Kremlin emissary. Now, yeah, I know Steve Bannon and others have said we were too dumb to collude with ourselves. It didn't have to be direct action in every step of the way. In July, when the DNC emails are released right before the convention, after it's been publicly stated that Russians hacked the DNC, and they're probably behind Guccifer 2.0, who's been releasing some of this material before this big dump, Manafort and Trump Jr., who at that meeting go on TV and they say, this is ridiculous. This is a hoax. The Russians aren't doing this. The DNC is making this up. The Hillary campaign is making all this up.
Hold on a second.
No. The point, he can say that to me, not you. But the point is, they're out there denying it's happening.
Look, you got to
Mr.
take a
Isikoff.
step back, I think,
All
to
right.
really understand this. Because, I mean, I do think, as David said, the word collusion kind of clouds the debate and is not really, in my mind, the relevant question to ask, because this is much broader. But imagine yourself, you're an FBI counterintelligence agent in the summer of 2015. And you start to see all this stuff. You know that the Russians have hacked the DNC. And
So
then
you said 2015 or 2016?
2016.
Right.
Actually, the FBI knew that the Russians had hacked the DNC in 2015. There was a problem communicating that.
Which you guys
to the,
lay out
to the
in
DNC.
extraordinary and distressing detail.
But then they see this character, Paul Manafort, becoming the chairman of the Trump campaign. Now, in the book, we have a quote from, it's actually one of the chapter titles, from Victoria Nuland, who is the Assistant Secretary for European Affairs, about her reaction when she learns Manafort is heading the Trump campaign. And her reaction is, Manafort, he's been a Russian stooge for 15 years. Now, why did she say that? Because he had spent years collecting millions of dollars as the consultant for the Russian thug who was the president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych. He'd been collecting money from the pro-Russia political party. But also Manafort was the business partner of a oligarch named Oleg Deripaska, billionaire aluminum magnate, who was identified in WikiLeaks cables as State Department cables as one of the 2 or 3 closest to Putin, and had been denied entry to the United States because of his ties to organized crime. We've since learned more about what the U.S. intelligence community knew about Deripaska, and this was put out by the Treasury Department just a few weeks ago, evidence linking him to extortion, racketeering, the murder of business rivals, and in addition to his Russian mob ties. So this was the guy who was the business partner of the chairman of the Trump campaign, right? And then it takes an even additional twist, because Deripaska and Manafort have a falling out, and Deripaska is pissed off because he thinks Manafort has stolen $18 million of his money on a Ukrainian cable deal, and so he's pursuing Manafort in litigation in the Cayman Islands and then in the United States. So think about this for a moment. The head of one of the 2 presidential campaigns is being pursued by a mobbed-up Russian oligarch close to Putin. And what does Manafort do? He starts offering Deripaska private briefings on what's going on inside the Trump campaign as a way to mollify him. So if you're looking for sort of compromising information about about the Trump campaign, start with that. This is something that the FBI
This is inspired. This just randomly came into my head for no reason. But one of the weird things about the political moment we're living in is if you describe the truth, you sound insane.
Yeah. Well, I think that is...
Because, if I didn't know that everything you were saying was true and based in deeply reported fact, I would be backing away from you right now and looking for an excuse to leave.
And
because
many
it
people
sounds
do back away
nuts.
from us, I should point
well,
out.
Well, in some ways, you've hit the nail on the head. That's Trump's grand strategy, to be so outrageous, to be so mobbed up and with everything that it seems ridiculous. I mean, to take a step back from that step back, there was a lot going on during 2016, and things do get kind of confused and conflated. There was I don't like the words intervention, meddling. I use them, but in the book, the subtitle would say Putin's War on America. This was an attack. It was information warfare that had been years, if not in the making, in the contemplation on the Russian side, and we detail the years leading up to this. But so there was that attack meant to screw up our election, sow discord, and at some point, it certainly hurt Hillary, and at some point help Donald Trump. At the same time, the Russians are trying to penetrate the Trump campaign. They're reaching out to these no-name foreign policy advisors of Carter Page and George Papadopoulos, trying to worm their way into the campaign to maybe gain influence, to at least to track what's going on. At another level, there's this connection between poor Manafort and Oleg Deripaska, and Manafort is offering at least information to Deripaska, make it even crazier, through a colleague of Manafort's who is named Konstantin Kalimnik, who used to work for Russian military intelligence. Right. So he's literally, his partner was in the Russian intelligence sphere, now giving information to Deripaska. And while all this is going on, there are people on the Trump campaign who are saying, we want to be friends with Putin from Trump on down. And Papadopoulos, who is being, in some ways, played by the Russians, is trying to create a back channel communication between the Trump campaign and the Russians. And then you have what I said a moment ago, the Trump campaign denying what it is the Russians are doing. So you can look at it from many different ways. It's that the Trump campaign were the victims of a Russian intelligence operation to penetrate it, at the same time helping the Russian operation against the Hillary Clinton campaign. And so I think if you're in the FBI, your head is just completely spinning on this one. So there's a lot going on, and it's important to separate this as you kind of try to figure out what the Trump people were knowingly doing and how they were also being duped or used as that phrase, useful idiots.
Right. One of the things that I think you guys established really well without a shadow of a doubt is that whatever they were doing in secret with the Russians, they were lying in public about what they knew.
Right.
Let me leave that aside just for a second, because I know that a lot of people, I'm assuming many of the people here, are thinking about Robert Mueller, they're thinking about his investigation, and what they're hoping for is a smoking gun, the equivalent of that last Watergate tape that Nixon finally handed over. And it's funny because I would think that just the information in your book would be enough, right? And yet, it isn't. It isn't. But I mean, if we had not known anything,
yes,
and you're
Dianu, this would have been enough.
Yeah, I know. It's like if we only had Papadopoulos, Dianu. But seriously, if like none of this was public and Mueller sort of published your book with his name on it, people would go, "My God, this is terrible. We should impeach the guy." Nonetheless, we're in a world where that didn't happen. So, can you guys imagine what the actual smoking gun in this case might actually show something that would not so much change the legal case, but change the politics of it?
Well, first of all, I mean, I agree with you that there is so much out there, and what we tried to do in the book is put it all together in a single narrative so you can make sense of it. And I think a lot of people, the reaction from the book to people who've read the book is, wow, they might have known bits and pieces here, but when you see it all laid out, you understand the enormity of what took place and how much is out there. But and I'm a little reluctant to speculate about that which we don't know, but just take the House Intelligence Committee report came out yesterday. One of the things that Adam Schiff brought out is they investigated the Trump Tower meeting. And begins with those emails from a character who is very prominent in our book, Rob Goldstone, the sort of wacky publicist for Emin Agalarov, the pop singer. That's how Trump got to Moscow for the Miss Universe pageant. They come back, they meet with Trump in Trump Tower. That's a new detail in our book that was not known before we published it. And then they set up the Trump Tower meeting. So after Donald Trump Jr. gets the emails saying that they've got all this stuff from the Russian government, sensitive documents about Hillary Clinton, they want to present to the Trump campaign to help Trump beat Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump Jr. makes a couple of phone calls. He wants to verify it from Emin himself. And Emin is in Moscow doing a concert, and he places a call. Trump Jr. doesn't get through, then places another call.
An unknown number.
Well, in between, he makes another call to Emin, but in between, there's a call from or to a block number. But there's a call with somebody at a block number.
Yeah.
Who was that? The committee knows that Trump himself had a block number at his home. Was there a phone call with Donald Trump? The Democrats on the committee wanted to subpoena the phone records for the president to see whether or not he spoke to his son in between those two key phone calls setting up the Trump Tower meeting. They did not get the blessing of their Republican colleagues to pursue that, so this remains an unknown piece of information.
And the supposition might be that when he point, Dad, I just got a call from the Russians.
Right.
They want to give us dirt on Hillary Clinton, to which the President of the United States might have said, that's great, go take the meeting,
Right.
which would be, as far as I know, if it were to exist, the first piece of actual evidence
Right.
showing that Donald Trump himself knew
Right.
that the meeting was happening.
And once you know, as I mentioned before, the new information we have in our book, that not only did Trump have this personal relationship with Goldstone and Emin Aguilera dating back to Las Vegas when they first set up the plans to have Miss Universe in Moscow, but he had the year before met personally with both of these characters at Trump Tower. I call it the first Trump Tower meeting. And in this meeting, Trump tells Emin, maybe next time you'll be singing, because he's a singer, at the White House, giving a pretty strong hint about his plans to run for president.
Now, can I make a point about Mueller? Because you asked about people looking for a smoking gun for Mueller that might settle things once and for all. Mueller's task is to not tell us what happened. It's really important to know this. His task is to look for crimes and bring cases that he can reasonably prosecute. That's his job. He is the special prosecutor. And the way it works for most federal prosecutions, except in very certain ones which you know much about, if you don't file a case, you don't talk about it. The information that you've discovered doesn't become public. Now, some of us in this room, or just a few of us, are old enough to remember the independent counsel for the Iran-Contras case. That was a different species. That was set up under a different law, and Lawrence Walsh, was mandated to write a final report explaining everything he had discovered and why he chose to prosecute and not prosecute. Mueller may discover that Trump did make that phone call, but he may find out, or he may reach the decision that it's not criminal, and therefore would not necessarily tell us. He does have the obligation to write a report to the Deputy Attorney General explaining his prosecutorial decisions. Now, it could be a very small report, it could be a very big report, but it's not necessarily a public report. It might be released, but I think, given what happened with Jim Comey and all the criticism he got for expounding on the Hillary Clinton case when he said he wasn't going to bring it, he may be less reluctant to do something along those lines. Which brings us right back to the clown show known as the House investigation. It is Congress's job to find the non-criminal smoking guns, right, to tell us what really happened, to give us the big picture, to do a better version of the book that some of you are holding in your hands. And on the House side, they've completely punted. We don't know what's going to happen on the Senate intelligence side yet. They're still working. But I don't get the sense that they have the staffing resources to be fully comprehensive.
I don't know if they've punted. They seem to have actually engaged in the...
they did the other... What's the... I don't know. They took the ball, ran to another stadium, called it baseball, and said everything was fine.
Yes, I know.
Okay, so maybe something like that.
So what you're saying is we shouldn't... I'm going to say they, shouldn't get their hopes up in terms of like Mueller will come in the manner of like a Deus ex machina at the end of a Greek play and restore justice to the universe.
I mean, this is the biggest question, hanging over the whole story. And as David says, Mueller, and I've covered Mueller for like 25 years I remember when he was the head of the criminal division of the Justice Department, and all he thinks about, I think from his first waking moment to when he goes to sleep at night, is indicting bad people and putting them in jail. I don't think he cares about anything else. I don't think he's particularly focused on writing a report that will become public or be sent to Congress that may or may not be used for impeachment purposes. I think he is strictly thinking about, what he can put into the four corners of an indictment and what evidence he can present in court. Now, there is he's indicted a number of people already: Manafort, Gates, Flynn. He's gotten cooperation agreements. He did that big indictment of the Internet Research Agency, the troll farm in St. Petersburg that did all the social media during the campaign, using phony identities of Americans and all the Twitter bots. But there is a big indictment that we do expect is coming relating to the hack of the DNC itself. That was clearly a crime,
right.
Stolen material on the internet, and it's a computer crime, and the big question is, will he name either indicted or unindicted co-conspirators who happen to be Americans and might have been affiliated with the Trump campaign? We don't know the answer to that, but that is the big thing to look for.
Remember with the 9/11 attack, the source of information that is the basis for what we know primarily was the independent commission, the independent 9/11 commission, which the Bush-Cheney administration fought against establishing. But there was such a bipartisan outcry in Congress and really throughout the land for this to be established that the Bush-Cheney administration went along with this. Unfortunately, what we see now, 17 years or so later, is a totally tribalized partisan reaction to this attack on the United States, which didn't happen after Pearl Harbor, didn't happen after 9/11, and it's prevented the processing of what happened. And you have no Republicans really in any leadership capacity who would agree to a commission of that sort.
I have to turn it over to the audience for their questions in a few minutes, but one of the things that I learned a lot from your book, I mean, you fill in a lot of detail on some of the stuff on the Trump side and the Russian side that I didn't know, that we didn't know. But there's a lot of new material, at least to me, about the Obama administration's reaction, or more to the point, lack of one, to all of this over the course of 2016 and even after the election. So I'm going to put it bluntly. How much responsibility does President Obama have for the situation we are in now? Because I think he might have a lot.
Remember, we're in Illinois.
Yeah, I know.
We're in Chicago.
I know.
Yeah.
Hometown.
I think this is something that a lot of the Obama people now agonize over, because most of them now realize that they screwed up and should have done a lot more than they did. It was a very difficult situation, in the summer of 2016. Obama did not want to be perceived as being political, given that the Democrats, the Clinton campaign, was making an issue of the Russian attack. He felt if he weighed in a public way, that would come off as putting his thumb on the scale in the election, or at least he would be attacked for that, and he didn't want to be attacked for that. But behind the scenes, there was a lot going on that we document. There were people on the National Security Council staff, the top experts for cyber and for Russia, who were arguing we need to strike back in real time. It's the only way to send a message to the Russians that they need to back off. They're doing something that we're not going to tolerate. And they came up with a lot of options, including cyber attacks on Russian news sites, cyber attacks on Russian online personas like Guccifer 2.0, just shutting them down, using some of the intelligence that the U.S. government had collected about Putin and corruption in his government and within his family, and dumping that on the internet to give Putin a taste of his own medicine, as one of them put it. And Obama didn't want to go there. Now, actually, and let me finish. And actually, because I got a lot more to say. But it's in the book, chapter 14, and there were a lot of reasons why Obama hesitated on this. One of them was a fear of getting in a cyber war with the Russians. And James Clapper, in the book, we talk about, warns that if we get into a cyber conflict like that, we could be more vulnerable than they are, and they could shut down our electric grid. This is actually one of the most frightening things in the book, that we are that vulnerable. And in fact, we just learned within the last few weeks that the U.S. government did have information that the Russians were probing that summer in the electric grid. So, there is a larger question about the state of cyber security, which I think, the Obama administration has to take responsibility for, Congress has to take responsibility for, and certainly the lack of action by the new Trump administration, plenty of responsibility there as well.
We have a quote in the book, and this is all laid out in what is my favorite chapter of the book, chapter 14, because it's really a kind of a what would you do chapter. We present both sides of the argument, the people who Mike just described as wanting very vigorous action right at the real time, including a cyber attack, and we have people in these highly sensitive, secure meetings in the Situation Room saying, well, if we're trying to prevent a new cyber Cold War, we can't engage in cyber attacks, and more importantly, we may be on the losing end of any such attack. And we quote Avril Haines, who was the deputy national security advisor, deputy to Susan Rice, who said of all her time in government, which is significant, this was the most difficult issue she had ever seen, ever confronted. One other thing that they kept in mind was the Russian plan was to sow discord and screw up our election. So Obama and his most senior aides worried that if they made too much of a deal out of this, that Americans would say, can we trust these election results? Maybe the Russians indeed are getting in there and screwing up, that they would be amplifying the Russian attack. So how to thwart it at the same and inform the public, which they eventually did, I think belatedly, but on October 7th, the same day that a certain videotape came out from Access Hollywood, they were really balancing a lot of competing interests. And one thing that Mike left out is that he was one of the first reporters in mid-August to note that part of what the Russians were doing, they were probing state election systems, going into databases, taking some data, looking around, and White House officials, once they heard that, totally freaked out, including the cyber people. They worried that there would be some shenanigans on election day that would not change results, but would cause America, you go there to vote and you're not in the database. And hundreds, thousands of people would say the election is fraudulent. And that would cause, with Trump predicting it was being rigged, would cause a tremendous chaos. So they became more concerned about preventing that from happening than worried about the hacks and the dumps, because they figured Trump's not going to win.
Well, I was going to ask that.
And that really motivated a lot of these assumptions.
We've been talking about that a lot in regard to Comey and his decisions in the context of his book. But it does seem, I'm sort of reading between the lines in your chapter on this, that, as you say, they were much more focused on potential cyber attacks on Election Day causing chaos, and less focused on the hacks that, by the way, had already happened. And so there's little, I mean, they couldn't have prevented them after the fact. Because is it possible that one of the things that was driving Obama and his lieutenants' reaction to this was the sort of essential belief that, well, yeah, they hacked and they released these emails and they did all these dirty tricks, but no one's going to elect Donald Trump, so we don't have to worry about it.
I think that was
Definitely.
a common assumption. Look, in the
The
entire
Russians probably
political
assumed
world,
that too.
Yeah, I know.
Well, look what we
the
did.
entire political world. But there's one more thing to say about this, and this gets to the larger intelligence failure for the U.S. government, is they completely missed the social media activity that was going on. The Facebook ads, the Twitter bots. That was not, they were sort of dimly aware there was something along those lines, but the enormity of that which we have since learned, the U.S. government was largely unaware of, which is really astonishing when you think about it. Part of this was, it kind of fell between the cracks. The U.S. intelligence community monitors what's going on overseas. It doesn't really pay attention to what's going on inside the United States. That's not within their purview. The FBI is focused on hacks. They didn't really have a unit to study what was or monitor what's going on in social media space. And so this huge component, part of the Russian arsenal in its attack, the government was largely unaware of. And what's particularly disturbing about that, when you read our book, is we document all the warnings that that the intelligence community had that this could be coming. We talk about this secret source in the Kremlin that who was part of Putin's inner circle, who was telling a U.S. government official in 2014 that that the Kremlin has a ambitious plan to attack liberal democracies with cyber attacks, with social media, with disinformation. It's much more extensive than you realize. It's going to be coming. All this was documented, and unfortunately, people at the top weren't paying attention.
I have one last question for you guys, but I'm going to save that for the end because I think it's time to open up the questioning to the audience for 10 to 15 minutes. And I think there are people in the audience with microphones, so you guys are going to be choosing the questioners, right?
Yes, indeed. Good morning. Real quick, first, a reminder that directly following Q&A, David will be signing books up on the second floor. There's a microphone down here with me and one up with Diane in the balcony, and we'll get to you. Raise your hands, and we'll bounce through as many questions as we can with the time we have.
You began your reporting on the subject long before Bob Mueller was appointed. Have either of you been interviewed by Mueller or his staff?
No.
No. And he's not interviewing reporters. He needs to get the information more directly.
Right. Well, quick follow-up. You guys are both, I know you are my name. David, I think your reporting is referred to
No,
in
David
the...
by name too.
oh,
We're
in
both
Nunes
referred
memo.
to.
In the Nunes memo.
Yeah. Both referred to in the
did
Nunes
those
memo.
guys, because they believe that you're part of the great conspiracy, did those guys ever reach out to you?
No.
No.
Okay.
No. And we probably wouldn't talk to them if they did anyway, so.
Up top.
Yes, we have a question in the balcony.
Good.
All right, thank you all so much for this wonderful conversation. You made the comment that you're writing about a house fire while you're in the fire and it's burning. How do you decide when to stop and say we're officially done here when literally as you're sending off the manuscript something else is happening and something else is
That's a
happening?
great question. We were dictated by a deadline from the publisher. So at some point we had to stop. We could have kept going on, and we kind of do that in our day jobs. But we started the book in the beginning of January 2017. And we kind of wrapped it up at the end of January of this year. And it's quite true that throughout that period, but more importantly, in the 6 weeks between, or 5 weeks between finishing the book and the book coming out in March, we were incredibly worried that new information would come out that would, change part of our narrative. Even though we wrote the book up to a certain point, looking at the stories so far. And actually, it turns out that as things have come out in the last couple of weeks, a lot of what's in the book gives you a foundation for understanding those things, and nothing's come out that has changed. So there's a few more information, a little bit about the Trump Tower meeting, that expands on what we have written about it rather than supplants it. And to me, it's just very gratifying that the book's done so well, because we did ask people to step off the hamster wheel of Twitter, cable news, and buy and read a book to tell you how we got to where we are here in a narrative fashion. And that seems to be something that, at least on this subject, people really wanted to have. And that's really encouraging for anybody who wants to write a book in the middle of a news cycle dominated by tweets.
Very quickly, you mentioned the Nunes memo. The day that came out was the day the manuscript, the edited manuscript, was going to the printer. And then we see the Nunes memo with both of us mentioned, the only two journalists who were mentioned, and I immediately called up the publisher and had a chance to say something I've always wanted to say: stop the presses. And they did, and we got a couple of references to the Nunes memo.
It's awesome.
Right over here, ground floor.
Yeah.
Your presentation convinced me that Trump is an egomaniac surrounded by corrupt people, and the Russians
took
interfered
this?
in the elections.
All right, but I'm sorry.
But the one thing I haven't heard is what are the 1, 2, or 3 items that actually Mueller or anybody else can prosecute Trump himself, as opposed to his staff and everybody else? What can he be prosecuted on?
Yeah, that's actually a really important question that legal scholars have been debating since Watergate, whether a special counsel can indict the President of the United States. There's a big fight over that, with some people saying there is the possibility that the special counsel could do this, and others saying since the President heads the executive branch of which the special prosecutor is part of, he can't be indicted under federal jurisdiction. We don't know where Mueller comes down on this. We don't know if he believes he has a case against Trump on a number of issues. It could well be that he decides at the end of the day that there's material that might lead to an indictment, but he may not have the authority to indict, in which he would then hand that material, maybe in the form of a report, to Congress, to the Judiciary Committee for impeachment consideration. But it's really, that's completely unsettled law, and if you get 2 constitutional lawyers in a room, you may get 3 opinions on this.
Next week, I'm interviewing Lawrence Tribe about this very thing, so you can read his book. Further questions, I'll let you guys keep
A
selecting.
question in the balcony.
Sure.
Thank you. You guys have done great work. Thank you for helping to save our democracy, if it's going to be saved. I wanted to follow up on Peter's question, because what you didn't mention in the basic explanation of why the Obama administration and its intelligence services did not do more to prevent this attack when they actually knew that it was in process, which you guys document. At that same time that you also explained that the Clinton campaign was screaming bloody murder, that the Obama campaign, the Obama presidency was not doing enough in order to offset this this attack, which you documented, irrefutably. So there was very strong opinion, and in the Intelligence Committee that something should more have done. So I want to repeat the question that you ask in your book on page 245.
I hate when people do this.
Remind me what
is
that
that
question was?
You don't remember. Okay. It had taken the White House months to inform the public of the Russian attack. Obama had threatened Putin, and this was in person, but had not imposed sanctions on Moscow. And a large question would linger: had they truly protected American democracy from Putin's information warfare? And don't forget, of course, you guys documented very well all those emails that come out. They did great damage. They alienated the Bernie factors, the Bernie bros rose up. How many of them didn't vote or become active because of all of that? No, you can't tell us if it affected the election, but it was a serious problem, and I want to know if you really think the administration did enough.
The problem that the Clinton folks had in making the argument, and they were trying to make it not just to the Obama White House. They were trying to make it to the press. They were trying to make it, on TV, anywhere they could.
During the debates?
During the debates, was that it looked like deflection from the content of the emails that were being released by, particularly the Podesta emails. The original DNC emails, to the extent that this was a Russian, that the Russians planned this. We know that they stole the material. We know, and even the House Republicans now accept, by the way, in their report, that that was the same material that made its way to WikiLeaks. When that got dumped in the Democratic convention, it sowed enormous discord. The Clinton and the Sanders people were hollering at each other. Debbie Wasserman Schultz had to resign. As an intelligence operation, it achieved its purpose. The Podesta emails, which came later, that was in October, did have a lot of damning stuff about the Clinton Foundation, about they released the records, the transcripts of those Wall Street speeches, which she had refused to release during the campaign, even though Sanders and the media were calling on her to do so. So when the Clinton folks wanted to talk about, you shouldn't report on this, that's not the story. The story is the Russian attack, and it was a Russian attack, there's no question about that. It looked to many like they were simply trying to deflect for political purposes, so they didn't have the standing to do what they were urging everybody to do. The Obama White House would have been better positioned to speak out, but they didn't.
Now, 2 points. I do think that the media failed. I don't blame political reporters for being obsessed with political juicy nuggets, and the speeches were not just nuggets, they were important, but there was a lot of inside gossip of Clinton world that certainly are worth their attention. But the media did not, should be able, this is a big should, does a lot of work in this sentence, to do that and to focus on something else at the same time. October 7th, of course, was when the administration announced that it officially confirmed that the Russians were attacking the United States and with information warfare, and that news was obliterated by the Access Hollywood tape. And then, although people kept paying attention to the Podesta emails, which were leaking 2,000 to 3,000 emails a day for the rest of the election and doing, I think, great harm to the campaign, they never really came back to the bigger story of the Russian attack. And the other thing that we didn't mention in talking about the Obama response is that I do think that Obama was somewhat boxed in a bit. This is not to excuse him, but to explain it by the Republicans. We go into great depth about how the Obama White House tried very hard to get Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan to work with the administration to present a case to the public that the Russian attack was real and something needed to be done about it. Problem was, at the same time, Trump was out there saying it's a complete hoax, it's phony, even after being briefed by the intelligence community on this, and we confirmed that he was told that this attack was underway, and that the election was going to be rigged. And so, going back to the point I made earlier, they were freaked out at the White House about what could happen on Election Day. And they wanted to work with state election systems, which control voting. And they felt that if this became too partisan, or was portrayed as too partisan, they couldn't work with localities in red states that were already loath to cooperate with the Obama administration. So I think one way that the administration response was in part a victim of hyper-partisanship in Washington, which I have to say was being driven in this instance by Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan and Donald Trump. And that made it really difficult for America as a whole to come to terms with this attack, acknowledge it, and have an honest discourse about what should be done.
I want to use that as a segue to what will have to be the last question, and I'm going to claim it for myself, which is this. We've talked a lot in detail. Your book is packed with detail. But I want to ask you both, because you've both been political reporters carefully watching American government for decades. So go 30,000 feet, go all the way back. Is there something about the 2016 election and everything that's followed, and I guess everything that's preceded it, that has made you change your mind about American society, American culture, American politics, the country we live? Because a lot of people are like going, I never thought this was possible.
Right.
The fact that it was possible and happened has made me, anyway, a lot less sure about certain things I used to think.
I think it has reinforced, I don't know about changed my mind, because clearly the signs of this have been building for many, many years, but it has reinforced and shown in the starkest possible way just how polarized we've become as a country, and how tribal we've become as a country. I mean, there's nothing more disorienting than at 9 o'clock at night, channel flicking from Rachel Maddow on MSNBC to Sean Hannity on Fox. I mean, they are literally occupying two different planets in which there is no common ground whatsoever, which is what makes this such a conundrum, for those of us who do want to see some resolution, because it's increasingly apparent that whatever the resolution is, it's not going to be accepted by a big chunk of the country. And that is disheartening. And I'm not sure I have a solution for how we get beyond that, but if anything shows just how divided we've become, it's been this experience.
I don't want to be more disheartening than Mike.
Consider it a challenge.
It's a bit of a challenge. I mean, I'm disheartened by the fact that we can't have honest debates based on real facts. And I think it's easy to say it's because of partisanship and tribalization, and that makes it sound like both sides are doing the same thing. I don't think that's the case. I think if you look at the book by Norm Ornstein and Thomas Mann that came out a few years ago and that they put out in paperback, it's very clear to me that one side, and it sounds, I know, I hate saying this, I yearn for the days of Bob Dole, but that one side has decided that reality-based politics is not in their interest. And so don't clap, please, because it really makes me sad to say this. Whether it's on climate change, on Russia, on tax cuts, that they don't think they have the truth at an advantage. So they deny reality. They won't address these issues that I think are quite important and the details. And instead, as we've seen in the Russia, and we get into this a little bit, they deflect. They say unmasking is more important. They say an abuse of a FISA warrant is more important than the fact that we were attacked by a foreign power. I mean, I think that's absolutely absurd and ludicrous. And you can talk about all those other things and whether they have merit to them, and they may even have some merit. But, and that Trump leading the way got elected with this type of approach to American life and American discourse. The heartening thing is that, people keep saying, am I living in a bubble? Am I living in a bubble? Yeah, there are bubbles. But the number of people who voted against Trump is a bigger bubble than the other bubble. And the people who care about Russia, according to the polls, is a much bigger bubble than the people who don't. And so I think, if anything, the last 2 years has just shown how high the stakes are, and that if you care about information-based political discourse, you got to say something. You can't just let the politicians or the partisans or the pundits be in charge of that, because at this point in time, it's going to take a wave. I'm not talking about the midterm elections. I mean a different type of wave to reset our political culture.
I think I have been accused of friends by always insisting on having the last word, but I think I'm going to get over that and say thank you very much to David
Well, thank you,
and
Peter.
Michael for being here. David will be upstairs. Michael has to run a...
I got to run to catch a plane to go to the White House Correspondents' Dinner tonight. Trump won't be there, but there'll be a lot of reporters who will be getting awards for the great coverage they've been doing of the Trump presidency, and I want to honor that. I've already signed a bunch of books. David will sign the rest
I'd
of
rather
them.
be here with you guys.
Yeah, all right.
Thank you all for coming, everybody.
All right.